I'm sorry, I didn't know I was like this.
Mr. D'Angelo, what are you doing here? Laura Bell's voice came out in a sharp cry, half panic, half utter mortification. She froze. The most dangerous man in New York was standing in front of her, in her bedroom, and she was only wearing tiny shorts, a baggy old concert tee, bare feet. Everything wrong. Everything perfectly vulnerable. Wrong door, Arturo D'Angelo said, his voice husky, his dark eyes traveling over every inch of her. But he didn't leave, and Laura replied, "But you never get doors wrong. Today, I did. Fatal mistake, because Arturo D'Angelo didn't get anything wrong, and now Laura Bell had become the obsession of a man who didn't know how to lose." Hi everyone, I'm Lena, the author of this channel, and today, I wanted to thank our members. Thank you so much for your support, guys. So if you want to be featured in the next video, answer me below. What do you like most about my stories? I'll be reading all the comments. Chapter 1, The Wrong Door and the Awakening.
Wrong door. Or fate.
The blood on the concrete floor was still fresh when Arturo D'Angelo placed his gun back in the inner holster of his jacket, his movements calculated and precise as always, unhurried because dead men don't run. The negotiation had failed at exactly 9:23 in the morning, when Salvatore Russo decided he could lie about the numbers and get away with it, and Arturo had given him exactly 15 seconds to retract before pulling the trigger. The other two, loyal but stupid lackeys, had tried to draw their weapons and sealed their own fate before they could even touch metal. 3 bodies on the floor of the abandoned Brooklyn warehouse, 3 spent bullets, 3 problems eliminated before noon. Levian Rossi, his consigliere, was already on the phone organizing cleanup, while Arturo wiped his hands on a white handkerchief he threw on the floor with the corpses, because dirt was dirt, no matter the origin. The morning was too beautiful for a day when he'd taken 3 lives, but the contrast never bothered him, never made him question, because this was his world, and always had been since he was old enough to hold a gun. He drove back to the mansion in silence, driving his own car because sometimes he needed total control of the wheel and the road to process what he'd done, even though processing was too strong a word for something that was simply necessary. The blood was only mental now, invisible but present, and he would climb the house stairs, take a long, hot shower, and continue with the rest of the day as he always did, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. I was in my small room when he arrived, but I didn't know yet, had no way of knowing that the entire mansion had become different since morning, quieter, more tense, charged with that heavy energy that came after something terrible happened. I'd spent the day working on the upper floors, changing sheets and dusting furniture, and the other maids were acting strange, whispering in Italian too fast for me to follow, avoiding making noise and walking on tiptoes as if the floor would explode at any moment. Maria, the older housekeeper, had shot me a warning look when I passed her in the hallway, the kind of look that said, "Don't ask, don't look, don't exist too much today." And I'd obeyed, because 6 months in that house had taught me when to disappear and when to become completely invisible. I caught fragments of conversations in the kitchen, loose words like negotiation failed, and 3 of them, and had no choice, and my stomach churned because I wasn't naive enough not to understand what that meant in the world where I worked now. Levian had passed me in the hallway with a closed and tense expression, speaking quietly on the phone, and other men in dark suits came and went for hours, all avoiding looking at us, at the maids who cleaned and served and pretended not to exist. The tension only worsened when I heard heavy footsteps climbing the main staircase in the middle of the afternoon, and I didn't need to see to know it was him, because Arturo D'Angelo had a presence that preceded his physical arrival, a weight in the air that made everyone stop and hold their breath. I hid in one of the empty suites, pretending to fix curtains that were already perfect, hoping he'd pass right by, that I could remain invisible and safe in my insignificance. I heard doors closing with controlled force up on his floor, heard the deadly silence that always accompanied him, and prayed for the day to end so I could return to my room and forget there was a world out there where men killed and died before lunch. When I finally returned to my small space in the maid's wing, the sun was already setting, and I was exhausted from accumulated tension and constant fear. I closed the door with a shaky sigh of relief, happy to have survived another day, happy to be able to breathe without fear for a few hours before everything started again tomorrow. I kicked off my uncomfortable shoes and threw them in the corner, changed out of my stiff uniform into a loose t-shirt from some old concert and short shorts that were old but comfortable, and turned on music on my phone because I needed to push away the dark thoughts clinging to my mind. The familiar melody filled the small room, and I started singing along, off-key as always, not caring because here no one heard me, no one judged me, no one needed to know I used music and dance as an escape from the heavy reality surrounding me. I spun around the room barefoot, letting the music carry me, smiling to myself and singing too loud, feeling a lightness that only existed here, in this tiny space that was completely mine, and where I could be genuinely myself without masks risks or fears. It was in the middle of a spin, completely lost in the music and the good feeling of finally being free, that my bedroom door opened and the entire world stopped spinning with me. Arturo D'Angelo stood in the doorway, watching me, and for one infinite second neither of us moved, neither of us breathed, neither of us could process the impossibility of what was happening there. The music kept playing on my phone, but my voice died in my throat because he was there, in my room, looking at me with an intensity that made every cell in my body go into immediate panic. I stumbled over thin air from pure shock and fell off the bed in a humiliating and awkward thud, with my short shorts riding up even higher and exposing practically everything, while my loose t-shirt twisted around my waist and left me completely vulnerable. I managed to get up too quickly, almost tripping again on the sheet that had gotten tangled around my foot, and stood there trembling all over because Arturo D'Angelo never got doors wrong. Everyone in the mansion knew that. So what the hell was he doing in my room? He didn't move, stayed there standing with those dark eyes fixed on me, and the expression on his face was something I'd never seen before, something between surprise and fascination, and a contained hunger that made my stomach flip with fear, and something else I didn't want to name. The silence stretched between us, heavy and dense, and charged with a strange electricity, while he observed me as if he were seeing something he didn't expect to find, something that had caught him completely off guard. "Mr. D'Angelo?" The words came out in a high-pitched and desperate scream that echoed in the small room and made me want to disappear from embarrassment. "What? Why are you here?" I pulled my t-shirt down in a completely useless gesture, trying to cover myself, trying to recover some remnant of dignity, but it was impossible when he'd seen me dancing and singing off-key like a complete idiot. He took a step into the room, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded absurdly loud in the tense silence that had settled between us. My heart raced, because now we were locked in there together in that tiny space, and I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to react, didn't understand anything about what was happening. His eyes traveled over my body from top to bottom, lingering on my bare feet, moving up my legs exposed by the short shorts, stopping at the loose t-shirt that suddenly seemed to reveal more than it covered. "Wrong door." His voice came out hoarse and deep, loaded with something that made my skin break out in goosebumps all over, and my stomach tighten in a strange and frightening way. He didn't look away for even a second, kept watching me with that deadly intensity that was his trademark, and I felt completely exposed and naked under the weight of that gaze that seemed to see through me and reach places no one had ever reached before. The silence returned to dominate the room, and I tried to breathe, tried to think, tried to form some coherent response, but my brain had stopped working completely because none of this made sense. The words came out in a trembling whisper before I could think better of the idiocy of questioning Arturo D'Angelo about anything. "But you never get doors wrong." It was true, and everyone knew it, because he had a frightening photographic memory and absolute control over every inch of his territory. He remained silent for so long that I started to think he wasn't going to answer, that he was simply going to continue standing there, watching me with those dark and penetrating eyes, until I completely fell apart. But then his lips curved into a line that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't neutral either, and his eyes finally met mine with an intensity that made my heart stop for a second, before racing in a chaotic and terrifying rhythm. Today I did. The words fell between us like stones thrown into a still lake, creating invisible waves that I felt spreading and changing everything even without understanding how or why. The way he said it, the tone of his deep and hoarse voice, the expression in his dark eyes, everything indicated this was much more than it seemed, that there were meanings hidden beneath the three simple words that I couldn't decipher but felt in my gut. He stood there for one more infinite second, watching me as if he were memorizing every detail of the scene, and then he turned and left the room with the same silent and deadly elegance with which he'd entered. The sound of the door closing sounded like a period at the end of a conversation that had changed everything without me understanding exactly what, and I stood there in the middle of the room trembling and unable to form a coherent thought, while the music kept playing as if nothing had happened. I turned off the music with shaky hands and sat on the bed, because my legs had turned to jelly and weren't supporting me properly anymore. My heart was beating so hard, I could hear the sound of it echoing in my ears, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably, while I tried to process what the hell had just happened there. Arturo D'Angelo had entered my room, had seen me in my most vulnerable and unguarded moment, had stood there watching me with that impossible-to-ignore intensity, and then had admitted he'd made a mistake, as if that were some kind of important confession. The tears started flowing without me noticing, hot and silent, because I was scared and confused, and completely lost about what to do with this impossible situation. Men like Arturo D'Angelo didn't get doors wrong, didn't do anything by accident, didn't stand around watching insignificant maids unless there was a reason. And the way he'd looked at me, that contained hunger in his dark eyes, that hadn't been casual or unimportant. I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes tightly, trying to erase the image of him standing in the doorway, but it was impossible because it was burned into my retina with painful clarity. The short shorts, The loose t-shirt, the bare feet, the humiliation of having fallen off the bed in front of him, all of it mixed with the memory of that intense gaze and the hoarse voice saying, "Wrong door," and today I did, and my brain couldn't stop reliving every second of that impossible encounter. The night fell heavy and endless, while I lay there, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but think about him, and what had happened, and what it could mean. I tried to convince myself it meant nothing, that it had just been an embarrassing accident that we would forget and never mention again. But deep down I knew I was lying to myself, because the way he'd looked at me hadn't been casual at all. I turned over in bed for the 1,000th time, hugging my pillow and trying to breathe slowly to calm my heart that was still beating too fast. 3 floors above, in the private wing that I only cleaned when he wasn't there, Arturo D'Angelo was also awake, but I didn't know that yet. Had no way of knowing he was sitting in his office with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and his mind stuck on the image of a barefoot girl dancing and singing off-key with a genuine smile on her lips. The morning had been brutal and dark as it always was when men died by his hands, and Arturo had returned home carrying the familiar weight of 3 necessary executions, and a darkness that always accompanied him after days like this. He'd climbed the stairs wanting only silence and solitude, but had turned in the wrong direction for the first time in years, and when he opened that door, he'd seen something that cracked the armor he'd kept in place for so long, he didn't even remember what it was like to live without it anymore. Laura Bell dancing barefoot, spinning with impossible lightness, singing off-key and happy, being completely genuine and free in a way he hadn't seen in years, maybe had never truly seen in his world, where everything was calculation and control and death. And something in him, something that had been dead and buried for so long he didn't even know it still existed, had awakened upon seeing that pure and simple light existing in the same universe as the 3 lives he'd taken that morning. He drank more whiskey, trying to drown the image of her that insisted on staying in his mind with an irritating and impossible-to-ignore clarity. He tried to convince himself it was just exhaustion, just the weight of the brutal day, just a momentary distraction that would pass once he slept. But the more he tried to forget, the clearer the memory became, until he could see perfectly the short shorts, the exposed legs, the way she'd fallen off the bed scared and adorable and completely unguarded. The night dragged on long and sleepless while he drank and thought and tried to understand what was happening to him, because Arturo D'Angelo didn't lose control, didn't get distracted, didn't let anything interfere with the perfect and deadly functioning of the machine that was his life. But Laura Bell had interfered without even trying, without even knowing, just by existing and dancing and singing, and being real in a world where nothing was real. When the sun began to rise and he was still awake, still seeing that smile and those bare feet and that impossible lightness, Arturo finally admitted to himself the truth he'd tried to deny all night. She couldn't stay away, couldn't continue being just another maid he glimpsed in the hallways when he passed by. He needed to hear that off-key voice again, needed to understand what she'd awakened in him, needed to have her close where he could observe and protect and possess. The decision was made there, in the silent hours before dawn, while he drank the last sip of whiskey and accepted that something fundamental had changed the moment he opened that wrong door. Laura Bell was going to work directly for him now, was going to stay in the private wing where he could see her, was going to be close enough for him to hear that voice that had brought lightness to his darkness. And when Arturo D'Angelo decided something, the entire universe reorganized itself to make it happen, no matter who or what stood in the way. Chapter 2: Transfer and Confrontation.
You work for me.
Short for me.
I slept poorly, and woke up even worse, with my body aching from being tense all night, and my mind exhausted from replaying that impossible moment when Arturo D'Angelo had entered my room and changed everything, without doing absolutely anything, except look. I went down to the common areas of the mansion with swollen eyes and a churning stomach, praying for the day to pass quickly and without incident, praying he wouldn't be around, and I could pretend yesterday hadn't happened. Maria found me in the hallway before I even reached the kitchen to get coffee, and the expression on her face was strange, a mixture of confusion and poorly disguised curiosity that made my stomach tighten even more. She pulled me into an empty corner and whispered in heavily accented Portuguese that I'd been transferred, that from now on, I would work in Mr. D'Angelo's private wing, and the way she said it, with wide eyes and a tense voice, made it clear this wasn't normal, that it had never happened before. Transferred? The word came out in a high-pitched whisper, because my brain refused to process that absurd and terrifying information. But why? Did I do something wrong? The questions came out in a desperate rush, while my heart started beating faster, and panic rose up my throat, because working directly for him meant being close, meant seeing him every day, meant no longer having the luxury of hiding and disappearing when necessary. Maria shook her head and said she didn't know, that the order had come directly from him early that morning, that Levian had communicated the change, and that I should report to Mr. D'Angelo's office at 10 o'clock to receive instructions. The clock on the wall showed 9:40, and I felt my legs go weak. Because in 20 minutes I would have to face him again, would have to be in the same room as the man who had seen me dancing and singing off-key last night. I climbed the stairs with trembling steps, and my heart beating so hard I thought I'd throw up before getting there, and each step seemed like an eternity, while I tried to prepare something to say, tried to find courage I didn't have, tried not to fall apart completely before even knocking on the door. The private wing was silent and intimidating, decorated with expensive furniture and expensive artwork, and everything there screamed power and danger and a deadly elegance that made me feel even more out of place. I stopped in front of the dark wooden double doors leading to his office and took 3 deep breaths before I could raise my hand and knock, and the sound of my knuckles hitting the wood sounded absurdly loud in the heavy silence of the hallway. His voice came from inside, deep and controlled, telling me to enter, and I pushed the door open with trembling hands and entered the office that was as big as the entire Maid's floor. Arturo was sitting behind a huge mahogany desk, wearing an impeccable dark suit, and his eyes rose to meet me the exact second I crossed the door. The air left my lungs in an involuntary gasp, because he was even more imposing and dangerous in daylight, and the memory of yesterday came back with full force, reminding me of the short shorts and the loose t-shirt, and the humiliation of having fallen off the bed in front of him. "Miss Bell," he said my last name with that hoarse and deep voice that made my skin break out in goosebumps, and gestured to the chair in front of the desk with an elegant movement of his hand. "Sit." It wasn't a request. It was a clear and direct order, and I obeyed because my knees were shaking, and I didn't trust my legs to keep supporting me if I stood for much longer. I sat on the edge of the soft leather chair, with my back straight and my hands clasped in my lap to hide how they trembled, and tried to keep my expression neutral, while he continued watching me with that intensity that seemed to see through all my defenses. The silence stretched between us for seconds that felt like hours, and I wanted to say something, wanted to ask why I'd been transferred, but the words stuck in my throat under the weight of that dark and penetrating gaze. "You've been transferred to the private wing." He finally broke the silence, and his voice was firm and controlled, without any trace of the emotion I'd seen yesterday when he admitted he'd gotten the door wrong. "Starting today, you work directly for me. Take care of my quarters, serve my meals when I eat here, organize the library and office. Understood?" I nodded in a mechanical movement because I couldn't form words yet, but then anger started rising mixed with fear and confusion, because this wasn't fair, didn't make sense, and he couldn't just transfer me without explanation after invading my room and changing everything. "You entered my room yesterday." The words came out before I could think better of the idiocy of confronting Arturo D'Angelo, but now that I'd started I couldn't stop. "That's inappropriate." His eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips curved into a line that could be interest or amusement, or something else I couldn't identify. I did. The answer came simple and direct, without denial, without excuse, without any trace of regret or embarrassment, and that made me even more furious because he didn't even try to pretend it had been an innocent accident. "Why?" My voice came out louder than I intended, loaded with all the frustration and confusion that had accumulated since last night. "Why did you enter my room? Why did you stand there watching me? Why are you transferring me to work directly for you now?" The questions came out in a desperate rush, while I leaned forward in the chair, momentarily forgetting fear under the weight of the need to understand what was happening. He remained silent for a moment that was too long, watching me with that intensity that made me feel completely exposed and vulnerable. And then he stood up from the chair in a fluid and elegant movement that made me recoil instinctively, even though I was on the other side of the desk. He walked around the huge piece of furniture with calculated and silent steps, and every inch he approached made my heart beat faster and my breathing more difficult. "I don't usually get doors wrong." His voice came out low and controlled as he stopped in front of me, so close I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. So close I could feel the heat emanating from him, and the smell of expensive cologne clinging to his skin. But yesterday I did, or maybe I didn't. The last words fell between us, loaded with a meaning I couldn't decipher but felt in my gut. I stood up from the chair in an abrupt movement because staying seated while he was standing and so close was unbearable. But that only made the situation worse because now we were just inches apart, and I could see details of his face I'd never noticed before. The small scars marking his skin, the perfect shape of his jaw, the absolute intensity in his dark eyes. "But you did, and now you're transferring me? Why?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky at the end, betraying how affected I was by his proximity. Arturo took another step in my direction, and I backed up until my back hit the bookshelf behind me, and now I was trapped between the solid wood and his imposing body that seemed to occupy all the available space in the huge office. He placed one hand on the shelf beside my head, leaning slightly forward, and the movement completely surrounded me without him needing to touch me, imprisoned me without using force, dominated me just with his presence. "Because I decide." The words came out firm and absolute, loaded with a power that admitted no questioning or resistance. And I decided you work here, with me, now. He paused and his eyes dropped from my face to my body, traveling over the simple uniform I wore, lingering on the modest curves before returning to meet my gaze. This doesn't make sense. I managed to whisper, even with my throat tight, and my heart beating so hard I thought it would explode, because none of this made sense, because ordinary maids weren't transferred to work directly for the Don without reason, because the way he was looking at me wasn't professional or appropriate or safe. His other hand rose and the long, elegant fingers touched my chin, forcing me to keep my gaze fixed on his dark eyes as he leaned even closer, so close I could feel his breath brushing my cheek. It doesn't need to make sense. His voice came out low and dangerous, loaded with a veiled threat that made my stomach flip, and something else awakened deep inside me. You obey. Understood? I should say no, should push him away and run out of that office and this mansion and never come back. But there was something in the way he looked at me, something in the intensity of his dark eyes, something in the proximity of his body that made my mind stop working properly. The chemistry I'd tried to deny yesterday was there again, multiplied by 1,000, vibrating in the air between us like a living and dangerous thing I didn't know how to control. Thus, understood. The word came out in a trembling and defeated whisper, because I had no choice, because he was Arturo D'Angelo, and I was just Laura Bell, because in his world what he decided became reality, regardless of what anyone else wanted. I saw something pass through his eyes when I gave in, something that looked like triumph and satisfaction and hunger at the same time, and the fingers on my chin squeezed lightly before releasing me. He finally stepped back and air returned to my lungs in a shaky and desperate gasp. But his eyes didn't leave me for even a second, continued watching me with that intensity that made me feel completely exposed. Good. His voice returned to the controlled and professional tone, as if the last few minutes hadn't happened, as if he hadn't just cornered and dominated me without needing to use force. You start tomorrow. Maria will show you the quarters and explain the routines. I moved away from the shelf with wobbly legs and tried to walk to the door with some dignity, but it was difficult when my entire body was shaking and my mind was completely messed up by what had just happened there. I put my hand on the doorknob and was about to open it when his voice stopped me mid-movement, deep and hoarse, and loaded with something that made my skin break out in goosebumps all over. Laura. It was the first time he'd said my name, without the formal last name, just my name in his deep voice, and the sound made something strange happen in my chest. I turned to look at him over my shoulder and saw he'd returned behind the desk, but his eyes remained fixed on me with that impossible-to-ignore intensity. His hair was slightly disheveled where he'd run his hand through it, and I realized it was the first time I'd seen anything about him out of place, any evidence that he was human and not just a perfect deadly machine. He didn't say anything else, just kept looking at me in that way that made me feel like I was burning from the inside, and I finally managed to open the door and leave the office before doing something completely stupid like asking why he'd said my name that way. The hallway was empty and silent when I closed the door behind me and leaned against the wall with my legs shaking so much I could barely stand. My heart was beating too fast, and my breathing came in short and irregular gasps, and I didn't know if it was fear or anger or that dangerous thing I didn't want to name, that forbidden and completely inappropriate attraction that had grown between us in less than 24 hours. I brought my hand to my chin where his fingers had touched and could still feel the heat of his skin on mine, could still feel the way he'd forced me to maintain eye contact while dominating me without needing force. Maria appeared in the hallway and guided me through the private wing, showing me the huge and luxurious quarters I would have to clean starting tomorrow, explaining his routines and preferences with a low and respectful voice that made it clear she feared him as much as she admired him. I tried to pay attention, but my mind kept going back to the office, to the way he'd cornered me, to the moment when he said my name and changed something fundamental between us. I spent the rest of the day in a state of silent shock, doing my old tasks for the last time, while trying not to think about what would happen tomorrow when I had to start working directly for him. The other maids looked at me differently now, with a mixture of envy and pity in their eyes, because working for Arturo D'Angelo directly was an honor and a curse at the same time, meant being closer to power, but also closer to danger. When I finally returned to my room that night, I threw myself on the bed and buried my face in the pillow, trying to muffle the scream of frustration that wanted to come out of my throat. Everything had changed in less than 2 days, and I no longer knew who I was or what I was feeling, only knew that Arturo D'Angelo had entered my life in the most violent and invasive way possible, and now I could no longer pretend he didn't exist. The worst part of it all was that part of me, a small and dangerous and completely irrational part, had liked the way he'd looked at me, had liked the proximity and the intensity, and that forbidden chemistry vibrating between us, and that scared me more than anything else, because I knew, Deep down, I knew that if I wasn't careful, if I let that attraction grow, I would end up completely destroyed in the process. But it was too late to go back now, because the decision had been made, and tomorrow I would start working directly for him. Tomorrow I would be too close to pretend. Tomorrow everything would change again, and I had no idea if I would survive what was coming. Chapter 3. Observation and Growing Possession.
Keep singing.
The first few days working in the private wing were a strange mixture of constant tension and almost normal routine, and I didn't know which of the two was more dangerous. I woke up early, climbed the stairs to his floor before the sun fully rose, and cleaned the huge quarters while trying not to think about who slept in that immense bed with black silk sheets, who showered in that Italian marble bathroom, who chose the expensive suits hanging in the closet that was bigger than my entire room. Arturo was rarely in the quarters when I worked in the morning, and I was grateful for that because I still hadn't learned to breathe properly near him. Still hadn't figured out how to make my heart stop racing when I heard his footsteps in the hallway. I cleaned quickly and efficiently, changed the sheets that always smelled of his expensive cologne, organized the office desk where important papers lay scattered in piles I didn't dare read, and tried to convince myself this was just a job like any other. But it wasn't, and I knew it every time I found some personal detail of his lost among the calculated coldness of the quarters. An old photo in a half-open drawer, a book marked halfway through on the nightstand, a bullet scar on the wall that had been covered with paint, but was still visible if you looked carefully enough. Arturo D'Angelo wasn't just the dangerous and deadly Don everyone feared. He was also a man who read before sleeping and kept memories and bled when he got shot. It was on the third day that he caught me singing, and the humiliation of that moment still burned in my cheeks when I remembered it. I was organizing the huge library that occupied an entire room on his floor, climbing up and down the rolling ladder to put books in alphabetical order as Maria had instructed, and without realizing it, I started humming softly to a song that had gotten stuck in my head. The melody came out off-key as always, but there alone I felt safe enough to let it escape, safe enough to be myself for a few minutes. I didn't hear when he entered the library, because his footsteps were always too silent, trained by years doing things that required silence and discretion, and the ability to appear without warning. I only noticed his presence when I turned with a stack of books in my arms, and almost dropped everything on the floor, because he was standing in the doorway watching me with that intensity that had already become both familiar and terrifying. "Mr. D'Angelo," my voice came out high-pitched and scared, while I held the books tighter to keep them from falling. I didn't know you were here." The words stumbled over each other while my face heated with embarrassment because he'd heard me singing again, and this time I didn't have the excuse of being in my own room thinking I was alone. He said nothing for a moment that was too long, just kept watching me with those dark eyes that seemed to see things I didn't show anyone, and then his lips curved into a line that almost could be called a smile if I didn't know men like him didn't truly smile. "Continue." The order came simple and direct, and I blinked confused, not understanding what he meant. Singing. "Continue." The air left my lungs in a shaky gasp, because this was impossible, was ridiculous, was completely inappropriate, and I couldn't imagine why he would ask for something like that. I can't. Sorry. I know it's inappropriate to sing while working." I tried to apologize, but he cut me off with a gesture of his hand, elegant and final like everything he did. "I didn't ask for your opinion, Laura." My name came out in his hoarse voice, and made my skin break out in goosebumps like it had in the office days ago. "Keep working. And singing." He turned and left the library before I could respond, and I stood there holding the books, and trying to understand what the hell had just happened, trying to process the strange order, and the way he'd said my name as if it were something precious and dangerous at the same time. In the following days, I noticed he made a point of being around when I worked, appearing in the office when I was cleaning, entering the library when I was organizing books, passing through the room when I was fixing curtains. And whenever I hummed softly without realizing it, whenever I let some off-key verses escape, he would stop what he was doing and stand there listening to me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It was Levian who finally said what everyone was already thinking, but no one had the courage to verbalize. I was leaving the office with the coffee tray I'd served when I heard raised voices coming from inside, and even knowing I shouldn't listen, even knowing it was dangerous, my feet stopped in the hallway and my ears caught every word of the tense conversation. "You're looking at her. A lot. This is dangerous." Levian's voice was low but urgent, loaded with a concern that rarely appeared in the consigliere's always controlled tone. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, hidden, holding the tray and holding my breath to hear better. "Mind your own business." Arturo's response came dry and cutting, in the tone I'd already learned to recognize as a final warning, the voice he used before bad things happened. But Levian didn't back down like I would have, and his courage in continuing to speak left me both impressed and terrified. Boss, she's a maid. You're the Dawn. This could... Levian tried to argue but was abruptly cut off by Arturo's voice rising a few notches, and the sound made my stomach flip with fear, and something else I didn't want to examine too closely. I know what she is, and I know what I am. Now get out. The words came out loaded with an absolute authority that admitted no discussion, and I heard Levian's footsteps moving away in the opposite direction from mine. I stood there trembling, processing what I'd just heard, trying to understand the implications of that conversation. About me, about us, about whatever was happening between me and Arturo D'Angelo. I managed to return to the kitchen with wobbly legs and a racing heart, and spent the rest of the day trying not to think about Levian's words, trying not to imagine what looking at her a lot meant exactly, trying not to feel that dangerous chemistry that grew every time Arturo and I were in the same environment. It was at the end of that same week that everything got even more complicated, when I was carrying a stack of clean towels that was too high to the bathroom and didn't see the Persian rug folded on the floor. My foot caught on the edge and I felt my balance slip, felt my body start to fall along with the pile of white towels, and closed my eyes expecting the painful impact against the cold marble floor. But the impact never came because strong hands caught me by the waist at the last second, pulling me back to balance with a strength and speed that took the air from my lungs. I opened my eyes and found myself inches from Arturo's face. So close I could see the small golden flecks in his dark eyes. So close I felt his warm breath brushing my cheek. So close my brain simply stopped working for a few seconds. His hands remained firm on my waist, his long fingers spread against the thin fabric of the uniform, and I could feel the heat of his skin burning through the clothes and marking my flesh underneath. Time stopped completely in that frozen moment, while we looked at each other without blinking, without breathing, without being able to move, or pull away, even knowing we should. "Thank you." The word came out in a trembling and weak whisper, and I tried to pull away, but his hands didn't release me immediately, kept holding me with a possessive firmness that had nothing to do with concern about keeping me on my feet. His eyes dropped to my face, lingered on my lips, returned to meet my gaze with an intensity that made my stomach flip, and something hot spread through my entire body. "Careful." His voice came out hoarse and low, loaded with something that went far beyond professional concern. "I don't want you hurt." The tone was possessive, dominant, as if I were his property that needed to be protected and kept intact, and that should scare me. But instead, it made something dangerous awaken deep inside me. I'll be careful." I managed to whisper, even with my throat tight, and my heart beating so fast, I thought I'd pass out right there in his arms. He finally released me, but his eyes didn't leave mine, kept watching me with that contained hunger I'd seen before, but that seemed more intense now, more dangerous, more impossible to ignore. It was at that moment that a female voice cut through the tension between us, cold and curious, and loaded with a sharp intelligence that made me recoil immediately. "Arturo, who is this?" I turned and saw a beautiful woman standing at the entrance to the hallway, wearing expensive and elegant clothes, with the same dark hair and the same penetrating eyes that Arturo had, and I knew immediately this was Bianca D'Angelo, his sister about whom the maids whispered with a mixture of admiration and fear. Arturo moved away from me with a controlled movement, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly, saw how his shoulders became tense, and realized he didn't like being interrupted, didn't like having to explain anything to anyone. Not even to his sister, Laura, the new maid for the private wing. The introduction came dry and short, without elaboration, but Bianca wasn't an idiot, and I saw in her eyes that she'd seen everything, had noticed the proximity, had noted his hands on my waist and the way we'd looked at each other. Bianca observed me from head to toe with an evaluative and cold gaze that made me want to disappear into the floor, and then her eyes returned to her brother with an expression that mixed surprise and something dangerously close to amusement. "I see," that was all she said, but the tone carried layers of meaning I couldn't completely decipher, implications that made my stomach churn with nervousness. I left there as quickly as I could without looking like I was running, but I heard when Bianca confronted Arturo in the hallway, heard her voice low and incisive, cutting through the silence. "You like her? The maid?" The question came direct, and without beating around the bush, and I almost tripped again, trying not to look like I was listening while moving away too slowly. "No." Arturo's answer came too quickly, too defensively, completely unconvincing even to me who was far away and couldn't see the expression on his face. Bianca must have thought the same thing because her laugh echoed through the hallway, low and knowing. "You're a terrible liar. To me, at least." Chapter 4. First Tension and Broken Rules.
Call me Arturo.
The following weeks passed at a strange rhythm, where I tried to maintain emotional distance from Arturo while working increasingly closer to him physically, and the contradiction was killing me inside. I learned his routine with surgical precision, knew exactly when he had breakfast, when he closed deals in the office, when he spent hours on the phone speaking in rapid and tense Italian about things I pretended not to understand even when I understood perfectly. And he kept watching me, whenever he thought I wasn't paying attention, whenever I turned my back or bent down to pick something up from the floor, and I felt the weight of that gaze on my skin as if it were something physical and real. The other maids had started looking at me differently, with a mixture of envy and concern in their eyes, because everyone in the mansion had already noticed that Arturo D'Angelo treated the new maid in a way that wasn't normal or appropriate or safe. Bianca appeared from time to time in the private wing, always with that knowing and slightly amused look that made me want to disappear into the floor. And every time she saw her brother and me in the same environment, her smile became more pronounced and more dangerous. She never said anything directly to me, but the looks she exchanged with Arturo were loaded with silent conversations I couldn't decipher, but that clearly irritated him deeply. It was on a Friday night that everything got more complicated, when I'd stayed late organizing the private library, because Maria had asked me to finish before the weekend. The mansion was quieter than normal, most of the maids had already left, and I was alone on that huge floor, trying to put the new books that had arrived on the high shelves. I climbed the rolling ladder with a heavy stack in my arms, stretching my body to reach the highest shelf, and was so focused on the task that I didn't hear when the library door opened and someone entered. I only noticed the presence when the hoarse and familiar voice cut through the silence and made my entire body shiver with surprise and something else I didn't want to name. Need help? The words came loaded with something heavy and tense, and I turned my head so fast I almost lost my balance on the ladder, holding tight to the shelf to keep from falling while my heart raced in my chest. Arturo was standing below the ladder watching me, and even in the dim light of the library I could see something was different today. Something in the way his shoulders were tense and his jaw clenched. "Mr. D'Angelo, I didn't hear you come in." The words came out in a high-pitched whisper, while I held the books tighter, trying to ignore the fact that he was looking at me from below, and probably saw more than I wanted to show because of the angle and the uniform skirt. The smell of whiskey reached me even from where I was, and I realized he'd been drinking, not enough to be drunk, but enough to be less controlled than normal. He took a step toward the ladder, and his hands closed on the metal structure on both sides, trapping me up there without needing to touch me, and the sudden proximity made my stomach flip and my breathing irregular. "I'm silent. Profession requires it." His voice came out hoarser than normal, loaded with a weight that went beyond physical exhaustion, and I wondered what had happened today, what tense meeting he'd had, how many lives he'd taken before coming home and finding me here. I can manage. Thank you." I tried to keep my voice firm and professional, but it came out shaky at the end, betraying how affected I was by his proximity, and by the way he looked at me, as if he were seeing something he wanted very much, but couldn't have. I put the books on the shelf with trembling hands and started to descend. But when I reached the middle of the ladder, I realized he hadn't moved away, was still standing there too close, blocking my descent. I stopped on the step where I was, and our eyes were almost at the same height, and the proximity was suffocating and electrifying at the same time, made my entire body vibrate with a strange energy I didn't know how to control. "Come down, now." The order came firm, but the voice was too hoarse, too affected, and I realized he was fighting against something, trying to maintain the control that always defined him, but failing in small and dangerous ways. I descended 2 more steps, and now I was completely trapped between his body and the metal ladder, so close I could see every detail of his face in the dim light. The small wrinkles around his eyes that showed exhaustion and years of tension, the perfect shape of his lips that never truly smiled, the intensity in his dark eyes that watched me as if I were the only real thing in a world of shadows and lies. The silence stretched between us heavy and loaded while we looked at each other, unable to look away, unable to pull back even knowing we should. And then his words came out low and confessional in a way that caught me completely off guard. "You sing every night. I hear you." The admission came loaded with a vulnerability I'd never seen in him before, and I realized his quarters must be close enough to my room for him to hear when I sang before sleeping. My breath came out in a trembling gasp, because this changed everything. Knowing he lay awake listening to my off-key voice cross through the thick walls of the mansion. Knowing he paid attention to me even when I thought I was alone and safe. Sorry if it bothers you." I tried to apologize, but he cut me off by placing his hand on the ladder railing beside my body, surrounding me even more without needing to touch me directly. "It doesn't bother me." The words came out firm and honest, and then he paused and his eyes dropped to my face with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "I like it." The confession came reluctant, as if he were admitting a dangerous weakness, and I realized this cost him a lot to say, cost him a lot to admit that something or someone had power over him in some way. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it, and I tried to find something to say, some way to break that tension growing between us like a living and dangerous thing. "Mr. D'Angelo, this is..." I began, but he interrupted me again, and this time his free hand rose, and his fingers touched my chin with a delicacy that completely contrasted with the strength and violence I knew he was capable of. "Arturo, The correction came soft but firm, loaded with a request or an order. I didn't quite know which. Call me Arturo. His eyes were fixed on mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away, impossible to deny what he was asking, even knowing that accepting meant crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. Arturo. I whispered his name for the first time, feeling the weight of the syllables on my tongue, and saw something pass through his dark eyes when I said it, something that looked like triumph and satisfaction, and a hunger that scared and attracted me at the same time. This is inappropriate. You're my boss. I'm a maid. I tried to bring reality back, tried to remind us both of who we were and the social abyss that separated us, but the words sounded weak and unconvincing even to my own ears. Arturo leaned forward, and now he was so close I could feel the heat emanating from his body, could feel his breath brushing my cheek, could see the way his eyes dropped to my lips and stayed there for a second that was too long. I don't care. The words came out in a raw and honest confession, and I realized he was telling the truth, that rules and hierarchies and social differences meant nothing to him in that moment. The entire world reduced itself to that small space between our bodies, to that suspended moment where everything could change irreversibly, and I knew that if he leaned in just a few more inches, if I didn't pull back now, something was going to happen that we wouldn't be able to undo later. My entire body vibrated with his proximity, and my mind screamed warnings I could no longer hear properly under the noise of my heart beating out of control. It was when the library door opened forcefully, and Levian's voice cut through the tension between us like a sharp knife. Boss! Urgent! The words came fast and tense, loaded with an urgency that admitted no delay, and Arturo pulled away from me so quickly I almost lost my balance on the ladder. I saw frustration pass over his face before the mask of control returned to place, saw the way his jaw clenched and his fists closed at his sides, before he turned to face Levian, who was standing in the doorway with a tense and worried expression. This isn't over, Arturo said, the words looking at me over his shoulder, and the tone was a promise and a threat at the same time, before leaving the library after Levian and leaving me alone trembling on the ladder. I descended with wobbly legs and leaned against the bookshelf, trying to recover my breathing and process what had almost happened there, trying to understand why I hadn't pulled back when I should have, why part of me had wanted him to lean in those final inches and end the tension once and for all. My hands were still shaking when I finally managed to finish organizing the books and leave the library, and I passed through the door where he'd cornered me just minutes ago, still feeling the ghost of his presence in the air. The mansion was silent and empty when I went down to the maid's areas, but my mind was too loud, too full of dangerous thoughts and forbidden desires I could no longer completely deny. I know exactly what dangerous thoughts she's having. Chapter 5: Jealousy and First External Threat.
No one touches you.
I spent the entire night tossing and turning in bed, unable to forget the moment in the library, unable to stop thinking about how close he'd been, and what would have happened if Levian hadn't interrupted. Morning came with gray skies and the threat of rain, and I went down to the mansion's inner gardens carrying a basket of clean towels that needed to be stored in the external depot, grateful for the chance to breathe fresh air and try to organize my jumbled thoughts. It was when I was crossing the main garden that Luca, the young gardener who'd started working at the mansion a few weeks ago, saw me and waved with a gentle and completely innocent smile. He was truly Italian, had come from Naples a few months ago, and his heavy accent made everything he said kind of funny and charming in a carefree way. "Good morning, Laura." He put down the pruning shears and came in my direction, wiping his dirt-covered hands on his apron, and the wide smile on his tanned face was so genuine I couldn't help smiling back. "Are you okay? You look tired today." The concern in his voice was real and friendly, nothing more than basic human kindness, and for a second I allowed myself to appreciate the simplicity of that interaction. "I slept badly," I responded with a half smile, adjusting the basket on my hip. "But I'm fine, thanks for asking." Luca nodded and commented something about the new roses that had arrived, about how he wanted to plant them in the flower bed near the fountain, and I kind of listened while observing the flowers he pointed at, mentally thanking him for those minutes of normalcy in a world that had become completely chaotic. "Do you like flowers? I can make a bouquet for you if you want." The offer came sweet and innocent, accompanied by that open smile, and I was about to respond that it would be nice when I felt that strange sensation on the back of my neck, that weight of being watched. I turned my head instinctively and my stomach plummeted when I saw Arturo standing at the window of his second-floor office, his eyes fixed on me and Luca, and even from far away I could see the tension in his body, the way his jaw was clenched. I need to go. The words came out rushed while I quickly moved away from Luca, practically running to the depot. And when I looked back, I saw he'd been confused by the sudden reaction, but had already returned to work. I stored the towels with trembling hands and went back inside the mansion, trying not to think about the expression on Arturo's face, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the contained fury I'd seen in his eyes. I spent the rest of the morning working in the private wing, but Arturo didn't appear like he usually did, and his absence was almost as disturbing as his constant presence had been in recent weeks. It was only in the middle of the afternoon that Maria called me in the hallway, with a worried and somewhat frightened expression, and my stomach was already churning before she even opened her mouth. Mr. D'Angelo sent for Luca to his office. She whispered the words, looking around as if afraid of being heard. Door closed. This isn't good, Laura. This is never good. Her tone carried years of experience working in that house. Years seeing what happened when Arturo D'Angelo closed the office door with someone inside. I stood in the hallway, feeling panic rise up my throat because I just knew, this had to do with me and the innocent conversation in the garden, had to do with the way Arturo had looked at me from the window, and the fury I'd seen on his face. I ran up the stairs even knowing I shouldn't, even knowing that getting involved in this would only make everything worse, but I couldn't stand still while Luca was in there being interrogated for something he hadn't done wrong. I got close to the office door and heard muffled voices coming from inside. Luca's confused and scared, Arturo's icy and controlled in a way that was much more terrifying than any scream. I pressed my ear against the heavy wood and managed to catch fragments of the conversation that made my blood freeze in my veins. You spoke to Laura. Why? Arturo's voice was low but loaded with a veiled threat that didn't need to be verbalized to be understood, and I heard Luca stammer a nervous response. I was just being polite, sir. She's a coworker. Be polite away from her. Understood? The tone had gotten even colder, even more dangerous, and I could perfectly imagine the expression on Arturo's face, the way he must be looking at poor Luca with those deadly eyes that made grown men tremble. There was a pause, and then Luca's voice came louder, loaded with genuine confusion. But she's just a maid like me, sir. I don't understand why. The sound of a chair being pushed forcefully cut through the air, and I heard heavy footsteps, and then Arturo's voice exploded in a tone I'd never heard before, loaded with a violent possessiveness that made my heart stop. She's mine, my responsibility, He paused, and the silence that followed was so loaded I could barely breathe. You don't talk to her, don't look, don't breathe near her, or you're out, permanently. Understood? Yes, sir. Sorry, I didn't know, I'll never again. Luca's voice was completely terrified now, and I heard more footsteps, and then the door opened so suddenly I almost fell forward. Luca came out practically running, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear, and passed by me without even seeing me as he stumbled down the stairs. I stood there in front of the open door, and Arturo was on the other side staring at me, and the expression on his face was something between fury and satisfaction, as if he'd just solved a problem that bothered him. Our gazes met, and everything I'd held in since morning exploded in a wave of anger and indignation. I entered the office and slammed the door behind me hard, and the words came out in a scream I didn't even try to control. You threatened Luca! Why? He was just nice to me, just talked. He didn't do anything wrong. My hands trembled with anger as I advanced in his direction, momentarily forgetting who he was and what he was capable of. Arturo didn't back down, didn't show any regret or guilt, just watched me with that familiar intensity while adjusting his shirt cuffs in a calm and calculated gesture. He was too close. The words came out simple and direct, as if that explained everything, as if that justified having terrorized an innocent boy. He was polite. You can't just threaten people because they talk to me. My voice rose a few more notches, and I felt tears of frustration burning in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in front of him. This is insane. Arturo moved so fast I didn't even see it, and suddenly he was in front of me, so close I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, and the sudden proximity made all words die in my throat. I can, and I will. His voice came out low and dangerous, loaded with an absolute authority that admitted no discussion. Nobody touches you. Nobody looks at you. Only me. The air left my lungs in a trembling gasp, because the raw possessiveness in those words was terrifying and thrilling at the same time, made my entire body react in ways I didn't understand or control. You don't own me, I managed to scream, even with my voice failing, even with my heart beating so fast I thought it would explode. Arturo leaned forward until his lips were dangerously close to my ear, and the whisper that came next was low and loaded with a dark promise. Not yet, but I will. The words vibrated against my skin and made something hot spread through my entire body, and I knew I should push him away, should run out of that office and never come back, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. I finally managed to pull away from him and ran to the door, leaving the office with my heart racing and my mind completely messed up, because part of me was furious with his possessiveness, and another part, a small and dangerous part, had liked hearing those words, had liked knowing he saw me as his in some primitive and an irrational way. I went down the stairs stumbling and almost bumped into Levian, who was coming up with a tense and worried expression. He grabbed my arm to steady me, and his eyes traveled over my face with professional attention, before speaking quietly. "You need to be careful, Laura. People are noticing." "Noticing what?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer, even though I already felt the weight of the implications of that observation. Levian looked around to make sure we were alone before responding, "That you're important to him. And when someone is important to the Dawn, that person becomes a target." The tone was serious and loaded with a genuine warning, and my stomach churned when I fully understood what he was saying. "Target of who?" I whispered, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "His enemies." Levian paused and squeezed my arm lightly before releasing it. "Matteo Caruso, specifically. He has spies everywhere, and if he finds out you're the boss's weakness..." He didn't need to finish the sentence because the implications were too clear, too terrifying. I left there with trembling legs and returned to my room, locking the door and throwing myself on the bed while trying to process everything that had happened today. Arturo had shown possessive jealousy in front of everyone, had threatened Luca for simply talking to me, had admitted he saw me as his property, and now I was in danger because of it, was becoming a target for dangerous men who wanted to use any weakness they found against Arturo D'Angelo. But worst of all was that even knowing this, even understanding the danger, I couldn't forget the way he'd said, "Not yet, but I will." Couldn't stop thinking about how those words had made my entire body react in ways that completely contradicted my anger. I was completely lost, and had no idea what to do, except hope that all of this wouldn't end up destroying me completely. It's that terrible moment that you've probably been through too, when you find yourself wondering, if everything keeps getting worse, will I be able to handle it? Chapter 6. Kidnapping and Forced Declaration.
You are dismissed, Laura.
Yes, Mr. D'Angelo.
Thank you.
Maria had asked me to go to the Italian market downtown to get the specific ingredients the chef needed for tonight's dinner, and I'd agreed, grateful for the chance to leave the mansion for a few hours and breathe air that wasn't loaded with tension and heavy stares. I grabbed the list and the house wallet, went down the stairs and told the security guard at the door I was going out, and he nodded distractedly while talking on the phone about something urgent I didn't pay attention to. The streets of New York were crowded as always, noisy and chaotic in a way that normally calmed me because it made me feel anonymous and safe in the crowd. I entered the little Italian market 3 blocks from the mansion, greeted the old owner who knew me from other times, and started looking for the items on the list while trying not to think about Arturo and Levian's warning about becoming a target of his enemies. It was when I was leaving the market with the heavy bags in my arms that I noticed the black car parked on the corner, the windows too dark to see who was inside, and something in my instinct screamed danger even before the back door opened and 2 large men got out heading in my direction. I tried to run, but they were faster, and a hand covered my mouth while the other grabbed me by the waist, and the bags fell to the ground, scattering tomatoes and basil on the sidewalk as I was dragged into the car. I tried to scream, but the hand on my mouth pressed too hard and panic took over me with such intensity I could barely breathe. And then, I felt something being pressed against my nose, a cloth with a strong chemical smell, and everything started to get dark and distant while my body stopped obeying my commands. The last thing I saw before passing out completely was the luxurious interior of the car and the low laugh of one of the men saying something in Italian about gift for the boss. I woke up in a dark and cold place, with my hands tied behind my back and my mouth too dry to scream. And panic returned with full force when I realized I was sitting in a metal chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. My head throbbed where it had hit something during transport, and when I tried to move, I realized my ankles were also tied to the chair legs, leaving me completely immobilized and vulnerable. Finally awake. The voice came from somewhere in the shadows, loaded with an Italian accent heavier than Arturo's, and a man emerged from the darkness with a smile that made my stomach flip with pure fear. He was older than Arturo, must have been around 50, and his eyes were cold and cruel in a way that made me immediately understand this was the type of man who had no moral limits. "Matteo Caruso," he introduced himself with a mocking bow, "and you must be D'Angelo's special little maid." I tried to speak, but only a hoarse and weak sound came out, and he laughed at that while pulling another chair and sitting in front of me too close enough for me to smell the expensive cigar stuck to his clothes. "You don't need to talk, dear. You just need to stay alive and pretty until your boss shows up to get you." The tone was too casual for the situation, as if kidnapping people was something he did every day before breakfast. And he will show up, because Arturo D'Angelo is predictable when it comes to things he thinks are his. Tears started flowing silently down my face while I trembled all over in the chair, and Matteo observed that with a satisfied expression, before getting up and walking around me like a predator circling prey. "Relax. I'm not going to hurt you. Not yet. You're much more valuable whole to use as bait. He stopped behind me, and I felt his hand touch my hair, and disgust rose up my throat along with fear. But if he takes too long, well, then we can have some fun. Arturo was in the office when he received the call from Levian with the news, and the phone lasted exactly 3 seconds in his hand before being thrown against the wall and shattering into 1,000 pieces. The mahogany desk that was over 100 years old was overturned with such force it cracked in half. Expensive books flew through the room, and the scream that came from his throat was something primitive and violent that made all the men in the hallway back away in fear. Mateo! The name came out like a death sentence, and Levian, who had seen Arturo in bad moments, knew he'd never seen this specific intensity of destructive fury. Where is she? Arturo's hands grabbed Levian by the collar of his suit and pushed him against the wall with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. We're tracking, boss, but Mateo's men are good at... Levian couldn't finish because Arturo released him and started systematically destroying the rest of the office, every expensive object becoming a projectile, every piece of furniture becoming firewood, and the only thing going through his mind was the image of Laura scared and alone in that animal's hands. It took 2 hours to get the location after Arturo had interrogated 2 of Mateo's men in ways that left the basement floor covered in blood, and when he finally had the address of the abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn, Arturo grabbed his favorite gun, checked the magazine, and left the mansion followed by 10 of the most loyal and deadly men he had. I had lost track of time when I heard the gunshots outside, the sound of breaking glass and men screaming, and Mateo, who had been smoking calmly in the corner, jumped up with his gun in hand and a tense expression on his face. Son of a bitch got here faster than I expected. He muttered more to himself than to me, and then came in my direction with the gun pointed. Looks like you really are important. More shots. More screams, and then the deadly silence that was almost worse than the noise, and I closed my eyes tightly, praying it was Arturo, praying he had come, even knowing he would have to kill to get to me. The warehouse door exploded in a shower of wood splinters, and Arturo entered with his gun raised, his eyes sweeping the environment until he found me, and the expression on his face when he saw me tied up was something between relief and a fury so intense that even Mateo took a step back. D'Angelo. Mateo tried to smile, but his voice came out tense. Long time. I see you're as predictable as... He couldn't finish the sentence because Arturo fired, and the sound of the shot echoed in the empty warehouse as Mateo fell to the floor with a perfectly centered hole in his forehead, his eyes still open in shock and surprise. I let out a muffled scream and started crying uncontrollably, because I'd seen a man die in front of me, had seen Arturo kill someone without hesitation, and even knowing who he was, even knowing what he was capable of, seeing it with my own eyes, was completely different. Arturo ran to me in a movement so fast it seemed blurred, and his hands were already cutting the ropes on my wrists, while his eyes traveled over my body looking for injuries. Are you hurt? Did he touch you? Answer! His voice came out desperate and urgent in a way I'd never heard, loaded with a real fear that completely contrasted with the controlled man he always was. The ropes finally came loose, and he pulled me out of the chair, his hands holding my face with a delicacy that didn't match the blood still fresh on his shirt. No, he didn't. I was just scared. I managed to sob between tears, and then his arms wrapped around me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. But I didn't care, because after hours tied up and terrorized, that hug was the safest and most comforting thing I'd felt in my life. His face buried in my neck, and I felt his irregular breathing against my skin, felt the way his entire body trembled slightly with adrenaline and residual fear. I found you. I'll always find you. Always. The words came out muffled against my neck, but loaded with an absolute promise. And then he pulled back just enough to look at my face, and what I saw in his eyes made my heart stop completely before racing in a chaotic rhythm. Arturo kissed me. It was urgent and desperate, and loaded with everything that had gone unsaid between us in recent weeks. And I responded without thinking, because fear had turned into need, because after thinking I was going to die, the only thing I wanted was to feel that I was alive. His hands were on my face, in my hair, pulling me closer as if he needed to make sure I was real, that I was there, that he'd arrived in time. When we finally separated, I was trembling and crying and completely lost, and he picked me up in his arms without asking permission and carried me out of the warehouse, passing by the bodies of Mateo's men he'd eliminated to get to me. He placed me in the back seat of the car carefully, got in beside me and pulled me close to him, and we sat there in heavy silence while Levian drove back to the mansion. Why did he take me? My voice came out hoarse and weak after endless minutes of silence, and I felt Arturo tense beside me before responding. Because he knows. His jaw was so clenched I could see the muscle pulsing, and when I turned to look at him, I saw his eyes were fixed on the dark window, but his mind was far from there. "Knows what?" I whispered, even though I already knew, even though I already felt the answer deep inside me. Arturo finally turned to face me, and what I saw in his eyes made new tears stream down my face, because it was pure and raw vulnerability, was admission of something he'd fought against for weeks, that you're my weakness, that I care too much. The words came out like a forced confession, as if it cost him everything to admit that out loud. "Arturo," I began, but didn't know what to say, how to process that declaration that changed everything between us. "I didn't plan this, didn't want it," he continued, the words coming out in an urgent rush now that he'd started. "But I can't stay away, can't not protect you, not want you." His hand rose, and his fingers wiped the tears from my face with an impossible delicacy coming from a man who had just killed 4 people to rescue me. "I'm a maid." I tried to bring reality back, tried to remind us both of the differences that separated us, but he cut me off by putting his finger on my lips to make me stop talking. "I don't care. About rules, tradition, or family." Arturo paused and his eyes pierced mine with absolute intensity. "I care about you." The words fell between us definitive and irreversible, and I knew in that moment everything had changed, that after today there was no going back, that we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I nestled against his chest and let the tears fall silently while the car cut through the night back to the mansion, and his arms held me tight as if he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. And maybe he was right to be afraid, because his world was violent and dangerous, and today I'd experienced firsthand what it meant to be important to Arturo D'Angelo. But even knowing that, even understanding the danger, I couldn't regret that kiss, or those words, or the way my heart had reacted when he said he cared about me too much. I was completely lost in him, and there was no going back. Chapter 7. Burning Scenes.
Stay with me.
Stay with me.
And final resistance. When the car stopped in front of the mansion, Arturo didn't give me a chance to get out on my own, simply picked me up in his arms again, and carried me up the main stairs, completely ignoring the shocked looks from the maids who were still awake. I tried to protest, tried to say I could walk, but he completely ignored me and kept climbing to his floor, to the private quarters where I only entered to clean. And when I realized where he was taking me, panic started rising in my throat. "Arturo, I shouldn't be here." The words came out in an urgent whisper as he opened the door to the huge bedroom with his foot and entered, still carrying me in his arms. The room was immersed in shadows, only the faint light from the city coming through the enormous windows. And he finally put me down near the bed but didn't completely release me, his hands still holding my waist as if afraid I'd disappear. "You stay with me, where I see you, protect you." His voice admitted no discussion, was firm and absolute, and when I tried to argue he put his finger on my lips again to make me stop. "I won't leave you alone tonight, or tomorrow, or ever again." His eyes pierced mine in the darkness of the room, and I could see the brutal sincerity in those words, could see he was serious. I pulled away from him with trembling legs and walked to the window, hugging my own body and trying to process everything that had happened today, trying to understand how my life had turned upside down so fast. "Arturo, the family, I began but couldn't finish because I didn't even know how to verbalize the fear I felt. The fear of being rejected, of being hated, of never being good enough for his world. I heard his footsteps approaching from behind, silent as always, and then felt the heat of his body close even without touching me yet. "They'll accept, or they leave." The words came simple and definitive, loaded with a power that left no room for questioning. "You think I care what they think? You think tradition or hierarchy or any other shit matters more than you?" I turned to face him, and he was so close I had to tilt my head back, and the faint light from the window illuminated half his face, leaving the other half in shadows, making him seem even more dangerous and beautiful at the same time. "But I don't come from an important family. I don't have money or power or anything that justifies." I tried to explain, but he cut me off with an abrupt movement, his hands rising to hold my face and force me to look into his eyes. "I want you, since that night, since I saw you dancing, singing, being you, light, real." The words came out loaded with a raw emotion I'd never seen in him, and I realized he was letting the mask fall completely for the first time, was showing me the man behind the deadly dawn. "You brought light to my world of darkness, brought lightness where there was only weight. And now that I've tasted it, now that I've felt it, I can't pretend I don't need this anymore." Tears started flowing again because it was too much, because he was saying everything I was afraid to admit I wanted to hear, was giving me something I didn't know was possible to have. "I'm scared of your world. Violence. Danger," I whispered with a broken voice, and saw pain pass through his eyes when he understood what I was saying, when he understood that his world scared me as much as it attracted me. Arturo pressed his forehead against mine and closed his eyes, and his breath came out shaky and heavy against my face. I'm scared too, of hurting you, of losing you, but I can't take it anymore. Away, pretending. His hands descended to my neck, to my shoulders, pulling me closer until there was no more space between our bodies, until I could feel every inch of him pressed against me. I can't take it either. The words came out in a defeated gasp, because it was true, because I'd fought against this for weeks, but couldn't deny it anymore. Couldn't pretend I didn't feel this impossible and dangerous attraction that had grown between us since that first night when he opened the wrong door. Arturo kissed me, and this time it was different from the desperate kiss in the warehouse. This time it was deep and slow and loaded with a promise that went beyond the physical. His hands were in my hair, on my waist, exploring me with a contained urgency that made my entire body tremble, and I responded with the same intensity, because after today, after almost losing everything, I didn't want to waste any more time pretending I didn't want this. He guided me back toward the bed, his lips never leaving mine, and when my legs hit the edge of the mattress, I let myself fall sitting down, and he came with me, kneeling in front of me and looking at me with an intensity that made my heart stop. His hands went to the button of the uniform I was still wearing, and he paused, giving me a chance to pull back, to say no, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want him to stop. His fingers unbuttoned the uniform with torturous slowness, revealing the skin underneath inch by inch, and his dark eyes followed every movement with a hunger that was almost tangible. When the fabric finally fell from my shoulders and got stuck at my waist, he paused again, and his eyes met mine in a silent question, and I answered by pulling him into another kiss that said everything I couldn't verbalize. The clothes came off slowly, first mine and then his, each piece revealing more skin, more heat, more of that impossible chemistry that had taken over us. When we were finally without barriers, when there was finally nothing between our bodies, Arturo laid me on the bed with a delicacy that completely contrasted with the urgency I felt vibrating in him. Mine, he whispered against my skin, as his lips traced a path down my neck, over my shoulders, and the words sounded like possession and promise at the same time. Always. I responded even with my voice failing, even trembling all over under his weight and the intensity of the moment, and I felt him smile against my skin before kissing me again. What happened after was an explosion of sensations and emotions I'd never experienced before. It was her femininity meeting his masculinity in a perfect fit that seemed to have been planned all along. There was urgency and delicacy at the same time. There were whispers of, "I'll protect you," and "I love you," mixed with muffled moans and irregular breathing. There was the feeling of finally being complete, in a way I didn't even know I was broken. Afterwards, when we were lying intertwined in the black silk sheets, with our breathing still irregular, and our bodies still vibrating with the remnants of what had happened, reality started slowly returning. I lay there against his chest, listening to his heart beat hard and fast, feeling his fingers trace lazy patterns on my back, and fear started infiltrating again through the cracks of temporary happiness. "The family will hate me," I whispered against his skin, and I felt his entire body tense before relaxing again with visible effort. His hand came to my chin and forced me to look up, to meet his dark eyes in the darkness of the room. "They'll respect you, because I order it." His voice was firm and absolute, with no room for doubt or questioning, and I wanted to believe that, but I knew the world well enough to know things weren't that simple. I laughed nervously, and the sound came out wet with unshed tears, and he frowned slightly, observing my expression. "You don't control everything," I tried to explain, but the words came out weak, because deep down I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. Arturo turned me on my side until we were face to face on the pillows, and the expression on his face was so serious and intense, it made my stomach tighten. "In my world? I do." He paused, and his hand rose to brush the hair from my face with a tenderness that was already starting to become familiar. "And you're my world now." The words fell between us, heavy and definitive, and I saw in his eyes he was being absolutely serious, that this wasn't just empty talk or temporary promise made in the heat of the moment. I nestled against his chest again, because I didn't know what to say, because part of me wanted to believe he could really protect me from everything, that love could be enough to overcome the differences between our worlds. His arms wrapped around me tight, and I closed my eyes, letting exhaustion and the trauma of the day finally take me, letting myself truly sleep for the first time in weeks, knowing I was safe. Arturo stayed awake long after her breathing became regular in sleep, watching her relaxed and peaceful face in the darkness, and the realization of what he'd just done, what he'd just admitted, weighed on him with a force he didn't expect. He'd crossed all the lines he swore he'd never cross, had let someone into a place he'd always kept empty and protected, had allowed himself to feel something that made him vulnerable in ways that could be deadly in his world. But when he looked at her sleeping in his arms, when he remembered the terror he'd felt when he learned Mateo had taken her, when he revisited the feeling of finally having her completely, Arturo knew there was no going back. Laura Bell had become the most important thing in his life, more important than power or tradition or anything else he'd built during years of blood and violence, and he was going to protect her, no matter the cost, no matter who stood in the way, no matter how many rules he had to break or how many enemies he had to eliminate. She was his now, completely and irrevocably, and anyone who tried to change that would discover exactly why Arturo D'Angelo was the most feared Don in New York. He kissed her forehead softly and finally closed his eyes, letting sleep take him too, and for the first time in years he slept without nightmares, only with the feeling of Laura safe in his arms, and the absolute certainty that he'd finally found something worth fighting to keep. Chapter 8. Public Acceptance and Breathing Together.
She is my future.
I woke up wrapped in silk sheets that smelled like him, and for a moment I allowed myself to pretend this was normal, that I belonged to that huge room and that giant bed, and the arms that still held me even during sleep. The morning light came through the enormous windows, illuminating Arturo's face, relaxed in a way I'd never seen when he was awake, and I realized this dangerous and deadly man was also human and vulnerable when he slept. I tried to move without waking him, but his arms automatically tightened, pulling me back against his chest, and his dark eyes opened slowly until they met mine. For a second, neither of us said anything. We just stayed there looking at each other while the reality of what had happened yesterday came back with full force, and then his lips curved into a half smile that was so rare it made my heart race. "Good morning." His voice came out hoarse from sleep, and something else that made my skin break out in goosebumps, and before I could respond, he kissed me, slow and deep, as if we had all the time in the world, and nothing outside mattered. When we finally separated, I was breathless and completely lost in those eyes that looked at me as if I were the most precious thing in the universe. "Arturo, I need to go back to my room. The maids will," I began, but he cut me off by putting his finger on my lips, and the expression on his face became serious and determined in a way I was already starting to recognize as a prelude to him doing something that would change everything. "No, you're not going back." He sat up in bed, pulling me with him, and his hands held my face, forcing me to maintain eye contact. "Today, I announced to the family, officially, you're no longer a maid, you're mine." The words came firm and absolute, with no room for discussion, but panic rose up my throat anyway. "They'll hate me. They'll say I'm an opportunist, that I tried to argue, but Arturo kissed me again, short and sweet this time, just to make me stop talking, and when he pulled away, his eyes were full of a determination that admitted no questioning. "They'll respect you, because I order it, and in my world, what I order becomes reality." He paused, and his fingers traced my jaw with a delicacy that contrasted with the firmness of the words. "Trust me, please." And I trusted, because I had no choice, because I'd already given myself completely to him, and now all that was left was to see if his world would accept me, or destroy me in the process. The D'Angelo family meeting happened in the late afternoon in the mansion's main hall, and I was hiding in Arturo's room trying not to throw up from nervousness while listening to the sounds of voices arriving downstairs. Bianca had appeared earlier, had looked me up and down with that evaluative expression, and then to my complete surprise had smiled and said, "About time he found someone who makes him truly smile." Arturo came to get me wearing an impeccable black suit that made him look even more dangerous and powerful, and when he saw me wearing the simple but elegant dress Bianca had insisted on lending me, his eyes darkened in a way that made my stomach flip. "Beautiful," that was all he said, but the way he said it, the tone of his voice, made it worth more than any elaborate speech. We went down the stairs hand in hand, and when we entered the hall, the silence was instant and heavy, all eyes turning to us with expressions ranging from shock to curiosity to poorly disguised disapproval. I recognized some faces from photos I'd seen while cleaning, uncles and cousins and important associates, all dressed expensively and emanating that air of power and danger that seemed to be the D'Angelo family trademark. Arturo guided me to the center of the hall with firm and confident steps, and when he stopped and turned to face the assembled family, his hand squeezed mine in a gesture of silent support before releasing it and placing his arm possessively around my waist. The silence deepened even more if that was possible, and then his voice cut through the air loaded with an authority that admitted no questioning. "Laura Bell is my woman, not girlfriend, not fling, mine." The words echoed through the huge hall, and I felt all eyes piercing my skin, judging, evaluating, trying to understand how a maid had managed to capture the Don's attention. "She has my protection, my name, my respect, and everyone here will treat her that way, or they leave, permanently." The silence that followed was so tense I could hear my own heart beating out of control, and then to my complete surprise, it was Bianca who broke that impossible moment. She stood up from the armchair where she was sitting and walked to us with a genuine smile on her face. And when she stopped in front of me, her eyes were full of an approval I didn't expect. "About time." "You're human again, Fratello," she said, looking at her brother with obvious affection before turning to me. "Welcome to the family, Laura, officially." And then she hugged me, quick but sincere, and that simple gesture made tears burn in my eyes because it meant acceptance in a way I didn't think was possible. Levian was next, standing up with that knowing half-smile on his face. "Boss, you're in love." Never thought I'd see the day. The tone was joking, but loaded with genuine respect. And when he extended his hand to me, I shook it with trembling gratitude. Take care of him. God knows someone needs to. The others accepted one by one, some with more reluctance than others, but none dared to openly question Arturo's decision, because everyone knew doing so would be signing their own death sentence. When the meeting finally ended and people started to disperse, I was emotionally exhausted but also lighter, because the first obstacle had been overcome, and I was still standing. It was 3 days later that revenge came, not from Matteo, who was already dead, but from the Caruso family who wanted blood for the execution of their patriarch. The attack happened in the middle of the night. Armed men invading the mansion in a desperate and poorly planned attempt to eliminate Arturo and send a message to anyone who dared defy their family. I woke up to the sound of gunshots and breaking glass, and before I could process what was happening, Arturo was already on his feet with his gun in hand, pushing me to the floor beside the bed and covering my body with his, while more shots echoed through the hallway outside. "Stay here. Don't leave. Understood?" His voice was hard and commanding, and I could only nod while trembling all over with fear. He left the room, and I stayed there lying on the cold floor, listening to the sounds of war happening in my new home, hearing screams and shots, and the sound of things breaking, and I prayed for Arturo to come back whole, for this to end soon. It took 15 minutes that felt like hours until silence returned. And then the door opened, and he entered covered in blood. I prayed wasn't his. "It's over. They're dead." That was all he said before going to the bathroom, and I followed him with trembling legs, and saw when he washed the blood from his hands in the marble sink, and the reality of his world hit me with full force in that moment. This was going to be my life now, waking up to attacks in the middle of the night, seeing him return covered in blood, living with the constant fear that one day he wouldn't come back. I don't know if I can live like this, with fear, violence. The words came out in a broken whisper as I leaned against the doorframe, and I saw when he stopped washing his hands and turned to face me with an expression that mixed pain and understanding. Arturo dried his hands and came to me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw tears in his eyes, saw real and raw vulnerability he never showed anyone. "I understand, and if you want to go, I'll let you, because I love you, and love is letting go, even if it destroys me." His voice failed at the end, and I realized this was costing him everything to say. That offering to let me go was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. Tears started streaming down my face as I processed those words, as I understood he was giving me a real choice, was willing to lose me if it meant keeping me safe. And it was in that moment of his absolute vulnerability that I understood with crystal clarity what I wanted. "I don't want to go. I want you." The words came out firm despite the tears. "This world, it's scary, but you're my peace, my safe place, my everything." I threw myself into his arms and felt when he held me so tight I could barely breathe, felt his tears wetting my hair, felt his entire body trembling with the relief of not having lost me. "You're my lightness, my light." Since that night, singing, dancing, you brought me back, alive. Arturo whispered against my hair, and for the first time in his life, he truly cried with relief and love and gratitude for having found someone who accepted him completely, darkness and all. We kissed there in the bathroom with mixed tears, and blood still fresh in the sink, and it was the most honest and true kiss we'd ever shared, because it was pure choice without illusions, was love despite fear, was commitment, even knowing the price. 6 months later, the mansion had changed completely, not in physical structure, but in the energy that filled the hallways and rooms. I had officially become Laura D'Angelo, the Donna, and the maids treated me with genuine respect, mixed with affection, because I'd never forgotten where I came from, had never let power go to my head. Bianca had become my best friend and confidant. Levian made jokes about how Arturo smiled now and that scared enemies more than the closed-off face from before, and the entire family had learned to accept me not just out of obligation, but because they saw the effect I had on their Don, saw how he was more balanced, more human, more alive. I was in the room that was now ours, singing off-key while folding clothes, and didn't even notice when Arturo entered silent as always and stood in the doorway watching me with that small but genuine smile that now appeared frequently when he was with me. I only noticed his presence when I turned and saw him there, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and that look that still made me melt inside. "You were watching me again," I accused with a smile, and he shrugged without any trace of shame or regret. "I'll always watch. I'll never get tired of seeing you being you." He came to me and pulled me into his arms, and even after months together, even living there officially, that hug still made me feel completely safe and loved. "Sing for me," The request came soft against my hair. You know I sing terribly. I laughed nervously, but started humming anyway. The same song I was singing that first night when he opened the wrong door and changed our lives forever. I felt when he completely relaxed against me, felt his breathing calm, felt the way he held me, as if I were the most precious thing in his world. Sing forever. For me, Arturo whispered, and when I lifted my face to look at him, I saw absolute love in the dark eyes that once intimidated me, but now only made me feel at home. Always. Only for you, I promised before kissing him. Slow and sweet, and in that kiss was everything we'd been through together. All the pain and fear and violence, but also all the love and acceptance and choice to be together despite everything. We could finally breathe, together, safe, loved. In the middle of the chaos and darkness of his world, we'd found light in each other, had found peace in the impossible, had proven that love could indeed overcome all differences and obstacles when it was real and true and strong enough to survive everything. And while I sang off key, and he held me as if he'd never let me go, I knew with absolute certainty I'd made the right choice, that this dangerous and deadly man was also my home, my love, my forever. The wrong door had become the right door, and his awakening had become the awakening of both of us to the possibility of true love in a world where love was the rarest and most precious thing of all. Curiosity time. The 2-year-old request. Alaric approached Klaus 2 years ago, long before the story began, to ask permission to court Mavie. It all started way before the red flowers. He'd been watching her since then, and chose to do things the traditional and honorable way first. The strategic 8 months. Alaric had been staying at the Burj Al Arab for exactly 8 months, always specifically requesting Mavie. It wasn't coincidence. It was him creating opportunities to be near her, after her father said to get to know her as a person first. Exactly 200 roses. Henrik's flowers were exactly 200 roses. An obsessive and specific number that already showed the sick nature of his fixation. It wasn't a lot of flowers. It was the precise count of a stalker. The shirt she never took off. Mavie deliberately never took off Alaric's shirt, even though he warned her. She wore it all day, defying him, showing that subconsciously, she'd already chosen to belong to him. Christoph, the silent hero. It was Christoph as a window sniper who saved Mavie with a surgical shot to Henrik's shoulder, not Alaric directly. The real hero was the man no one saw act. Alaric cried when asking for her hand. The most dangerous man Klaus knows, cried when he officially asked for Mavie's hand. A moment no one saw except Klaus, showing Alaric's real vulnerability away from the world's eyes. The clue Mavie caught. Henrik suggested taking Mavie to her father's house. An address nobody knew, except those with access to Alaric's confidential files. Mavie caught this immediately, and it was the first real clue of the betrayal. Hoffman and Becker. The final company has both last names in alphabetical order, not just Hoffman alone, showing that Alaric truly saw Mavie as an equal partner, not property or an accessory. And if you want to check out another story, click on the video that appears now on your screen.